What drives a man who has everything to crave the one thing he can never truly possess, the soul of another? The story of absolute power is not written in ink, but in blood, and it begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, carried on the sea breeze to an island fortress. How does a hero, a celebrated general who defended the borders of Rome, transform into a monster hidden away from the world, a spider at the center of a web of terror that stretched across an entire empire? Tiberius Claudius Nero, the successor to the divine Augustus, was a man of discipline, a soldier to the bone. Yet when the weight of the world was placed upon his shoulders, something inside him fractured. He did not break in the crucible of battle, but in the chilling silence of the Palatine Hill, where every smile concealed a dagger and every compliment was a prelude to a request. He fled the city he was meant to rule, trading the capital of the world for a rocky outcrop in the Bay of Naples. He fled to Capri, and it was there, on that island paradise, that he perfected the architecture of fear. The Villa Jovis, perched precariously on a cliff edge, was not a palace, it was a laboratory, a place where the emperor, far from the prying eyes of the Senate, could dissect the limits of human depravity and his own burgeoning madness. From this eagle's nest, he ruled the known world through messengers and decrees, each one steeped in a paranoia that curdled the very air in Rome. He had become a phantom, a ghost whose name was only spoken in hushed, terrified tones. Stories, dark and twisted, began to leak from the island like poison from a wound. Tales of elaborate orgies where the children of senators, snatched from their homes, were forced to enact depraved myths. He called them his minutiae, his little fishes, who would cavort around him as he bathed, teasing and nipping at him in a grotesque parody of innocence. Capri was where the law died, and the emperor's whim became the only reality. Those who displeased him were not simply executed, they were subjected to tortures so elaborate they seemed born from a fever dream, their final destination a long fall from the cliffs onto the jagged rocks below, where guards with oars and boat hooks waited to ensure no one survived the descent. Back in Rome, the city held its breath. The instrument of Tiberius's will was a man of terrifying ambition named Lucius alias Sejanus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus was more than a soldier. He was the emperor's eyes, his ears, and his vengeful sword. He understood the vacuum that Tiberius's self-imposed exile had created, and he filled it with himself. He perfected the art of the treason trial, turning the Roman Forum into a stage for state-sanctioned murder. A misplaced word, a forgotten birthday greeting to a member of the imperial family, a dream interpreted incorrectly. Any of these could be twisted into a capital offense. The delatore, professional informers, thrived in this toxic climate, growing rich on the confiscated estates of their victims. Sejanus systematically eliminated anyone he perceived as a threat, including Tiberius's own son, Drusus, subtly poisoning him and making his death appear natural. In Tiberius's Rome, silence was the only language that couldn't be misinterpreted as treason. Sejanus convinced the aging emperor that he was the only man he could trust, the sole bulwark against a sea of conspirators. He erected statues of himself throughout the city. His birthday was publicly celebrated, and prayers were offered for his health alongside the emperor's. He was the co-ruler, in all but name, the dark regent of a haunted empire. But the whispers of his ambition eventually reached the paranoid ears on Capri. Tiberius, the master of deceit, began to weave a counterweb, a trap so intricate that Sejanus would walk into it willingly, blinded by his own hubris. The emperor sent a long, rambling letter to the Senate, a masterpiece of misdirection. It began with praise for Sejanus, lulling him into a sense of security as he sat in the Senate house, basking in the adoration of men who feared him. But as the letter continued, its tone shifted subtly at first, then with devastating clarity, ending with a single, unambiguous command: arrest him. The senators, who moments before had been ready to prostrate themselves before Sejanus, turned on him like a pack of wolves. The fall was as swift and brutal as the rise had been methodical. The man who had been the second most powerful figure in the world was dragged from the Senate, his face beaten, his robes torn. The mob, so recently his adoring subjects, descended upon him with a primal fury. They tore his body limb from limb, dragging the pieces through the streets before casting them into the Tiber. His children were not spared. His young daughter, a virgin, was first violated by the executioner, as law forbade the execution of virgins, and then strangled alongside her brother. Tiberius, from his island fortress, unleashed a purge of unimaginable savagery. Anyone connected to Sejanus, however remotely, was hunted down and killed. The prisons overflowed, and the groans of the dying became the new soundtrack of the city. He had eliminated the monster he had created, but in doing so, he cemented his own monstrosity. He had shown Rome that power was not about governance or glory, it was about the meticulous application of terror. The final years of Tiberius were a grim spectacle of decay. He was a man consumed by his own demons, a prisoner on an island of his own making. He trusted no one. He loved no one. His only companions were astrologers, perverts, and the ghosts of the men and women he had destroyed. The empire ran on momentum, a vast, headless machine still grinding forward from the inertia of Augustus's reign. But the precedent had been set. The relationship between the ruler and the ruled had been irrevocably broken and replaced with one of master and slave. Power wasn't a responsibility anymore. It was a weapon. The emperor was no longer the first citizen. He was a remote, capricious god who could demand your life on a whim. The system of fear he perfected would become the blueprint for his successors, a dark inheritance passed down like a cursed crown. His death in the year 37 of the Common Era was met not with sorrow, but with a collective, shuddering sigh of relief. The people of Rome ran through the streets, joyfully shouting, "To the Tiber with Tiberius!" Yet, what they did not understand was that Tiberius was merely the prologue. He had been the slow, creeping horror, the unseen thing that lurks in the shadows. What was to come would be a different kind of madness entirely, a flamboyant, theatrical insanity that would take center stage and demand the world's applause. He had taught the Praetorian Guard a vital lesson during the fall of Sejanus, that even the most powerful men were vulnerable, and that the soldiers who guarded the throne were the ones who truly controlled it. This knowledge would soon give birth to a creature of pure impulse, a young man who had spent his childhood in military camps and his adolescence in the suffocating paranoia of Tiberius's court. His name was Gaius, but the soldiers had given him a nickname that would become synonymous with madness itself, Caligula. This transition from the grim, calculated tyranny of Tiberius to the explosive, surreal reign of his great-nephew was not merely a change in leadership. It was a seismic shift in the very nature of imperial insanity. Where Tiberius was a recluse who hid his depravities, Caligula would flaunt them. He would turn the empire into his personal stage, and every citizen from the highest senator to the lowest slave would be forced to play a part in his grotesque comedy. What would you do if you were a senator forced to run for miles alongside the emperor's chariot as a sign of respect? Tiberius had taught Rome to fear. Caligula would teach it to laugh at the abyss, a hysterical, terrified laughter that was the only sane response to a world gone mad. The Praetorians, flexing the muscles they had discovered in their takedown of Sejanus, presented this young man to the Senate as the new master of the world. They had created him, and in his initial days, he was everything they and the people had hoped for. He was generous, charismatic, and he dismantled the treason laws that had choked the city in fear. It was a false dawn, a brief, deceptive spring before an eternal winter of the absurd. The sickness took hold quickly. Perhaps it was a fever that addled his brain, as some historians suggest, or perhaps it was the sudden, intoxicating rush of discovering he was a god, not a god in the metaphorical sense that Augustus had been, but a literal, living deity who could do anything he desired. And what he desired was to shatter every taboo, to mock every tradition, and to hold a mirror up to the terrified face of the Roman elite and show them their own powerlessness. His reign became a piece of performance art, and its primary theme was humiliation. He would summon senators to his palace in the middle of the night, only to make them stand by his bed for hours or perform a ridiculous dance for his amusement. He turned the palace into a high-end brothel, forcing the wives and daughters of noblemen to serve as prostitutes, with the proceeds going to the imperial treasury. He didn't do it for the money, he did it to prove that he could. An emperor who declares himself a god makes only one mistake. He begins to believe he is immortal. His relationship with his sisters was the subject of the darkest whispers. It was said he engaged in incestuous relations with all of them, but his favorite was Drusilla. When she died, his grief was monumental and terrifying. He declared her a goddess, the first woman in Roman history to be deified, and made public mourning mandatory. A man was reportedly executed for having taken a bath on the day of her funeral. He would wander the palace at night, calling her name, demanding that the moon come down to him so he could speak with it. He dressed as various gods and goddesses, one day Jupiter, the next Venus, and demanded to be worshipped as such. He even built a bridge connecting his palace on the Palatine Hill to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, so he could, as he put it, consult with his brother deity without having to descend to the level of mortals. His madness was not chaotic. It had a terrifying logic of its own, a relentless drive to prove that he was above all human and divine law. Then came the horse. Incitatus was no ordinary steed. He had a marble stable, an ivory manger, a jewel-encumbered collar, and a retinue of slaves. Caligula would invite the horse to dinner, serving him oats mixed with gold flakes. But the ultimate joke, the punchline to his bloody comedy, was his announcement that he intended to make Incitatus a consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic. The senators, men whose ancestors had conquered the world, sat in stunned silence. Did they dare to laugh? Did they dare to object? They did neither. They applauded the idea. In that moment, Caligula had achieved his masterpiece. He had shown them that their precious offices, their traditions, their very dignity were worth less than his horse. Was it true madness, or was it the most scathing political satire ever performed? The annals claim the senators applauded the horse but were afraid to look its master in the eye. It was fear, it was madness, and it was a brutally effective calculation. His military campaigns were extensions of this theatre of the absurd. He marched the legions to the northern coast of Gaul, ostensibly to invade Britain. The soldiers prepared for a massive amphibious assault, but when they reached the English Channel, Caligula ordered them to halt. Their enemy, he declared, was not the Britons, but Neptune, the god of the sea. He commanded the legionaries to attack the waves with their swords and spears, and then, as their spoils of war, he ordered them to collect seashells from the beach, which he then had shipped back to Rome to be displayed in a triumphal parade. He had conquered the ocean itself. The soldiers who had followed his father, the great general Germanicus, were now reduced to fighting water and gathering shells. It was the ultimate degradation of the Roman military machine, a farce played out with the most dangerous army in the world. But the laughter was beginning to stick in people's throats. The constant threat of execution, the squandering of the treasury on lavish games and impossible building projects, the sheer, unrelenting insanity of it all began to wear thin. Conspiracies started to form, not among the humiliated senators who were too cowed to act, but within the one group that had the power to both create and destroy emperors, the Praetorian Guard. The joke had gone on for too long. The man they had placed on the throne had become a liability, a mad dog that needed to be put down. The leader of the conspiracy was Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the guard whom Caligula constantly mocked for his high-pitched voice and supposed effeminacy. It was a fatal mistake to humiliate the man who commanded his bodyguards. The emperor had made power a performance, and now the final act was being written by the men with the swords. The end came in a secluded corridor beneath the palace during the Palatine Games in the year 41. As Caligula was passing through, Chaerea and the other conspirators cornered him. The first blow was not fatal. The emperor, stunned, tried to flee, but he was trapped. The assassins fell upon him, a frenzy of blades, each man eager to bury his dagger in the body of the god. They stabbed him over 30 times. His wife and infant daughter were murdered shortly thereafter, the child's head smashed against a wall, ensuring that the divine lineage would not continue. The reign that had begun with such hope and descended into such farce ended in a bloody, ignominious heap. Rome was plunged into chaos. The German bodyguard of the emperor went on a rampage, killing anyone in sight. The senators, briefly tasting freedom, began to debate restoring the republic. But they had forgotten the lesson of Tiberius. They had forgotten who held the real power. In the confusion, a few Praetorian guardsmen looting the palace noticed a pair of feet trembling behind a curtain. They pulled it aside to find a terrified, stammering man, the emperor's uncle, Claudius. They had found their next emperor. The Praetorians, having just butchered one Caesar, now found themselves in the business of creating another. They did not see a leader in the shaking man they found cowering behind a tapestry. They saw a pawn. Claudius, long regarded as the family idiot due to his physical infirmities, a limp, a stammer, and a constant twitch, had survived the reigns of Tiberius and Caligula precisely because no one had ever considered him a threat. He was a scholar, a historian, a man who preferred dusty scrolls to the deadly game of politics. And now this 50-year-old academic was being hoisted onto the shoulders of soldiers, hailed as imperator, and presented to a bewildered Senate as the new master of the Roman world. Power in Rome wasn't inherited or earned. It was a prize won in a lottery of violence, and Claudius had just hit the jackpot. He began his reign by executing Caligula's assassins, not out of loyalty to his monstrous nephew, but to send a clear message. Only the emperor had the right to kill. It was a surprisingly shrewd move from a man everyone had underestimated. But while Claudius may have possessed a sharp intellect, his rule was quickly hijacked by those who could manipulate his insecurities. His court became a snake pit, dominated by powerful freedmen, former slaves like Pallas and Narcissus, and his ambitious, utterly ruthless wives. The most infamous of these was his third wife, Valeria Messalina. Her name has become a byword for sexual depravity, a reputation largely crafted by hostile senators who despised her influence. Yet the stories that survived paint a picture of a woman who wielded her sexuality as a weapon and an instrument of power. Suetonius and Tacitus recount tales of her legendary appetite, claiming she would disguise herself and work all night in a common brothel to satisfy her lust. In one notorious contest, she reportedly competed against a professional prostitute to see who could service more men in 24 hours, and won. Whether these tales are true or exaggerated slander, they point to a core reality. Messalina was a force of nature who operated outside the bounds of Roman propriety, and Claudius seemed either unable or unwilling to control her. Messalina's audacity reached its zenith when she decided to marry her lover, the handsome senator Gaius Silius, while Claudius was away from the city. It was not a secret affair, it was a public wedding, a brazen act of bigamy that was a direct challenge to the emperor's authority. Why did she do it? Was it a mad gamble for power, an attempt to replace the aging Claudius with her young lover? Or was it the ultimate act of a thrill-seeker who had grown bored with ordinary transgressions? Whatever the motive, it was a fatal miscalculation. When the news reached Claudius, his powerful freedman Narcissus finally managed to shake him from his stupor. He convinced the emperor that Messalina and Silius were plotting to kill him and seize the throne. The reaction was swift and merciless. Silius and his co-conspirators were rounded up and executed without trial. Messalina was cornered in the gardens of Lucullus, where she was given the option to take her own life. When her courage failed her, a tribune of the guard ran her through with a sword. Claudius was reportedly so detached from the event that when he was told of her death at dinner, he showed no emotion and simply asked for another cup of wine. The vacuum left by Messalina was soon filled by an even more formidable figure, Claudius's own niece, Agrippina the Younger. She was the sister of Caligula, a woman who had survived her brother's madness and exile, and she was determined to see her own son on the throne. She seduced her uncle Claudius, persuading the Senate to change the incest laws so they could marry. Once she was empress, she moved with chilling efficiency. She had her rivals executed or exiled. She secured the betrothal of her young son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, to Claudius's daughter, Octavia, and then she convinced Claudius to adopt her son, giving him a new name that would echo in infamy, Nero. With her son now in the line of succession, Claudius was no longer useful. He was an obstacle. In the year 54, after a meal of his favorite mushrooms, the emperor suddenly fell ill and died. The ancient sources are nearly unanimous. Agrippina had poisoned him, clearing the path for her 16-year-old boy to become the master of the world. In the perverse logic of Rome, the scholar who stumbled into power was eliminated to make way for a child who dreamed only of art. Nero's early reign, guided by his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, was a period of relative stability. But the boy who loved to sing, play the lyre, and write poetry was chafing under the thumb of his domineering mother. Agrippina had schemed and killed to place her son on the throne, and she had no intention of relinquishing power. She appeared on coins alongside him, tried to attend Senate meetings, and saw herself as the true ruler. This was a battle Nero was destined to win. Power, once tasted, is not easily shared. The first to go was Claudius's biological son Britannicus, a potential rival to Nero. He was poisoned at a dinner party, convulsing and dying in full view of the court, as Nero coolly claimed it was merely an epileptic seizure. His mother was horrified, but she had taught him too well. She had shown him that murder was the most effective political tool, and now he was turning that tool against her. Matricide was the ultimate Roman taboo, but for Nero it became an obsession, a necessary act of liberation. The attempts to kill his mother descended into a black comedy of errors. First, he tried poison, but Agrippina, ever suspicious, had built up an immunity by taking small doses over the years. Then, he arranged for the ceiling of her bedroom to collapse, but she was warned and escaped. His most elaborate plan involved a specially designed boat that would fall apart at sea. He invited her to a banquet and then sent her off on the collapsible vessel. The plan worked. The boat broke apart, but Agrippina, a strong swimmer, managed to make it to shore. Realizing her son was trying to kill her, she sent a messenger to inform him of her miraculous survival, a final, desperate attempt to call his bluff. Nero panicked. Convinced she would now seek revenge, he abandoned all pretense of subtlety. He sent assassins. When they cornered her in her villa, she supposedly bared her womb and cried, "Strike here, for this bore Nero!" They hacked her to death. The artist had finally freed himself from his greatest critic. With his mother gone, the last restraints on Nero's narcissism dissolved. He scandalized the aristocracy by performing publicly on stage, something no emperor had ever done. He saw himself as a world-class artist, a musician, an actor of unparalleled genius, and he craved the adulation of the masses. He instituted the Neronia, a festival of arts and athletics where he would compete and, inevitably, win every prize. Senators were forced to sit through his hours-long recitals, forbidden to leave even for the most urgent of needs. Tacitus reports that some men feigned death just to be carried out of the theatre. This was not the madness of a Caligula who sought to humiliate others. This was the madness of a man who desperately needed to be loved and admired, a narcissist so fragile that he had to turn the entire empire into his personal fan club. But the applause was beginning to sound hollow. and a far greater spectacle was about to engulf his reign. In the summer of the year 64, a fire broke out in the shops around the Circus Maximus. It would burn for 6 days and 7 nights, consuming 10 of Rome's 14 districts. This was the Great Fire of Rome. The city was a sea of flames, a panicked, screaming inferno. While his people burned, the legend, famously reported by Tacitus and Suetonius, claims that Nero stood on the roof of his palace, dressed in theatrical costume, and sang about the fall of Troy, playing his lyre as a backdrop to the destruction. Was it true? It is impossible to know for certain, but what is certain is what happened next. Nero seized a vast swath of the burnt-out city centre to build himself a new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. It was a monument to excess, a sprawling complex of villas, gardens, and an artificial lake, complete with a colossal, 120-foot-tall bronze statue of himself in the guise of the sun god. The people, homeless and ruined, looked at this opulent playground rising from the ashes of their homes and began to whisper that the emperor himself had started the fire to clear land for his project. The artist emperor was now cast as the ultimate villain. Needing a scapegoat, Nero found one in a small, obscure religious sect that was already distrusted by the populace, the Christians. He unleashed upon them a persecution of sickening cruelty. They were blamed for the fire and hunted down. Their executions were turned into public spectacles for the emperor's amusement. Some were crucified, others were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. The most horrific fate was reserved for the knights in his gardens. He would have Christians tied to stakes, covered in pitch, and set ablaze, using them as human torches to illuminate his evening parties. It was a new level of depravity, a marriage of artistic pretension and homicidal fury. But even this could not save him. The Pisonian conspiracy, a plot involving senators, knights, and even his own former tutor, Seneca, was a sign that the elite had had enough. The conspiracy was discovered, and Nero unleashed a wave of terror, forcing dozens of Rome's most prominent citizens to commit suicide. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who had once guided his pupil, received the death sentence and calmly slit his own veins. The poet Petronius, his arbiter of elegance, held a final, decadent party, where he also opened his veins, casually conversing with friends as his life ebbed away. But the rot was too deep. The legions in the provinces were in open revolt. The Senate, sensing his weakness, finally found its courage and declared Nero an enemy of the state. He was abandoned by everyone, even the Praetorian Guard. An emperor without an army is just a man in a fancy robe. Nero fled the palace, a terrified fugitive, and hid in a freedman's villa outside the city. Hearing the sound of approaching horsemen, he knew the end was near. With the help of his secretary, he placed a dagger to his throat. His final words, as the life drained from his body, were not those of an emperor or a tyrant, but of a performer giving his last encore. Qualis artifex, pereo? What an artist dies in me. His death in the year 68 marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family that had founded the empire. What followed was not peace, but a bloody testament to the instability he had left behind. For the first time, the secret was out. An emperor could be made elsewhere than in Rome. The legions now knew their power, and they were about to tear the empire apart to prove it. Who do you think was the more destructive force for Rome? The paranoid recluse who ruled through fear, or the narcissistic artist who ruled for applause? Let us know in the comments below. The death of Nero did not heal the empire. It ripped the scab off a festering wound. For a century, power had been passed down through a single, albeit dysfunctional family. Now the throne was empty, and the vultures began to circle. What followed was a year of sheer, unadulterated chaos, a bloody civil war that saw 4 different men claim the title of emperor in rapid succession. It was the year 69 of the Common Era, the year of the 4 emperors, and it was the moment the empire was put up for auction to the man with the biggest army. The first to seize the purple was Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Spain. He was an old, stern disciplinarian from an ancient patrician family, the very antithesis of Nero. But his rigid austerity was his undoing. He refused to pay the Praetorian Guard the bonus they had been promised for their support, a fatal error in judgment. In a city where loyalty was a commodity, Galba had tried to get it for free. His reign lasted a mere 7 months. The man who replaced him was Marcus Salvius Otho, a former friend of Nero who had been promised the throne by Galba and then passed over. Otho was a man of charm and extravagance, and unlike Galba, he understood that soldiers needed to be paid. He bought the loyalty of the Praetorians, who promptly marched to the Forum, cornered the 73-year-old Galba, and hacked him to pieces, parading his severed head on a spear. Otho was emperor, but as he was celebrating in Rome, the legions on the Rhine had already acclaimed their own candidate, Aulus Vitellius, a commander whose primary qualification for rule seemed to be his prodigious gluttony. 2 vast Roman armies now marched on each other, not to defend the empire's borders, but to decide which degenerate would rule it. The ensuing battle at Bedriacum in northern Italy was a bloodbath, a horror show of Romans killing Romans. Otho's forces were defeated. Upon hearing the news, Otho, who had ruled for just 95 days, decided to commit suicide rather than prolong the civil war. It was, perhaps, the only noble act of his life. Vitellius entered Rome not as a ruler, but as a conqueror. His reign was short, brutish, and centered entirely around the dinner table. He was a man of gargantuan appetites, and his brief time in power became one long, continuous feast. He reportedly spent fortunes on lavish banquets, sending the Roman navy to scour the seas for the rarest delicacies. His favorite dish was a concoction he named the Shield of Minerva, which included pike livers, pheasant brains, peacock tongues, and flamingo marrow. While the treasury was being bankrupted to satisfy his stomach, the empire was fracturing. The legions in the east, in Judea and Syria, were disgusted by the spectacle. They had their own candidate, a rugged, pragmatic general who was currently suppressing a massive Jewish revolt. His name was Titus Flavius Vespasianus, Vespasian. He was everything Vitellius was not, disciplined, competent, and from humble equestrian stock. Once again, the armies of Rome marched against each other. The second battle of Bedriacum was even more horrific than the first. The fighting raged through the night, the soldiers recognizing each other's units, fathers fighting sons, brothers fighting brothers. Vespasian's army was victorious, and they marched on Rome. The city descended into anarchy. Vitellius, in a moment of panic, tried to abdicate, but his own supporters refused to let him. The final battle was fought in the streets of the capital itself. The Capitoline Hill, with its sacred temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, was burned to the ground. Vitellius was found hiding in the palace porter's lodge. He was dragged out, half naked, a rope around his neck, and paraded through the Forum. The crowd that had once cheered him now pelted him with filth and insults. He was tortured, killed, and his bloated body was dragged with a hook and thrown into the Tiber, the final resting place of so many of Rome's discarded masters. The year of the 4 emperors was over. Vespasian was the undisputed ruler. He had waded through a river of blood to claim the throne, but his victory brought a semblance of stability. He founded the Flavian dynasty, and for a time it seemed the madness had passed. But the disease of absolute power is patient. It lies dormant, waiting for the right host. After the competent reigns of Vespasian and his son Titus, the throne passed to his other son, Domitian. Domitian was a return to the paranoia of Tiberius, a grim, solitary ruler who demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Master and God. He ruled with an iron fist, executing senators on the slightest suspicion and creating a climate of fear that rivaled the worst days of the Julio-Claudians. He was eventually assassinated in a palace conspiracy, stabbed to death by his own servants in the year 96. His death marked the beginning of a period that many historians consider Rome's Golden Age, the era of the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. These were men chosen for their ability, not their bloodline. For nearly a century, the empire was ruled by a succession of competent, sane, and philosophically minded men. It seemed the curse had finally been broken. The Roman state had found a formula for stability. But it all depended on one thing: a wise emperor choosing a worthy successor. And then came the last of the good emperors, the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius, a man who wrote meditations on Stoic virtue while waging brutal wars on the frontier. He was a paragon of Roman duty, but he made one catastrophic mistake, a mistake born not of malice, but of love. Instead of choosing the most capable man in the empire to succeed him, he chose his own son. That son's name was Commodus, and with him the madness returned with a vengeance. The Golden Age did not just end, it shattered. Commodus was the living embodiment of every fear the Roman aristocracy held about hereditary rule. He was the spoiled child who inherits a global corporation and decides to turn the boardroom into a wrestling ring. He had no interest in governing, in military strategy, or in the tedious work of administration. His passions were the chariot races and, above all, the gladiatorial arena. He saw himself not as an emperor, but as a divine superstar, the reincarnation of Hercules. His reign was the slow, humiliating decay of imperial dignity. He handed over the day-to-day running of the empire to a series of corrupt favorites who sold public offices to the highest bidder and plundered the state's resources. Meanwhile, the emperor himself was in training. He spent his days practicing with the gladius and the bow. His public performances were a grotesque parody of the games. He would enter the Colosseum dressed in a lion's skin, carrying a club just like Hercules. His opponents were not worthy adversaries. He fought against terrified gladiators who were ordered to let him win, and he delighted in slaughtering exotic animals from the safety of a raised platform. He reportedly killed 100 bears in a single day, along with elephants, giraffes, and ostriches, charging the Roman people an exorbitant price for each dead animal to reimburse the treasury. The son of the philosopher king had become a state-sanctioned butcher and a circus clown. The shame was palpable. The Roman elite watched in horror as their emperor, the living symbol of the empire's majesty, debased himself in the sand of the arena for the cheers of the mob. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He renamed the months of the year after his own various titles. He had statues of himself as Hercules erected all over the city. This was not the strategic madness of Caligula designed to humiliate the Senate. This was the pathetic, infantile madness of a man-child who craved validation and saw the most powerful office in the world as nothing more than a stage for his own vanity. Conspiracies were inevitable. The first, involving his own sister Lucilla, failed. It was followed by others, each one leading to a fresh round of executions and further cementing his paranoia. He became increasingly isolated, trusting only a small circle of cronies and his wrestling partner, a burly athlete named Narcissus. The end was as undignified as his reign. On the last day of the year 192, his advisors, including his mistress Marcia and the Praetorian prefect Latus, learned they were on his latest execution list. They decided to strike first. Marcia poisoned his wine, but Commodus, having drunk heavily, vomited up the poison. Panicked, the conspirators sent in the one man the emperor trusted implicitly, the one man who could get close to him without suspicion, his wrestling coach, Narcissus. He found Commodus in his bath, groggy and weak from the poison. The athlete did what he was paid to do. He strangled the life out of the divine Hercules. The news of his death was met with jubilation by the Senate, which immediately declared him an enemy of the state and ordered his statues to be torn down. But the stability of the Antonine dynasty was shattered. Once again, the throne was empty. And what happened next was perhaps the most shameful moment in the history of the empire. The Praetorian Guard, realizing they were the ultimate arbiters of power, decided to dispense with the pretense of acclamation or Senate approval. They put the Roman Empire up for auction. The highest bidder would be the next Caesar. The auctioning of the Roman world was not a metaphor, it was a literal event. After the murder of Commodus, the Praetorian Guard, the same elite soldiers who had once been the personal protectors of the emperor assassinated his brief successor, Pertinax, because he tried to instill discipline. They then retreated to their fortified camp and announced that the imperial throne was for sale. Two wealthy senators, like bidders at a cattle market, rushed to the camp walls and began to shout out offers. One was Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, the city prefect. The other was Marcus Didius Julianus. Standing outside the ramparts, they engaged in a bidding war, with the Praetorians acting as auctioneers, relaying the offers back and forth. Julianus won by offering a staggering 25,000 sesterces to every single guardsman. The gates were opened, and the man who had just bought the world was declared emperor. Didius Julianus's reign was a farce from the start. The Roman people openly mocked him, and more importantly, the powerful legions on the frontiers were disgusted. 3 different generals, Clodius Albinus in Britain, Pescennius Niger in Syria, and Septimius Severus in Pannonia, declared him a usurper and marched on Rome. Severus, being the closest, reached Italy first. The Praetorians, who had been so brave in selling the throne, proved to be cowards in defending it. Didius Julianus's brief 66-day reign ended when a soldier sent by the Senate found him cowering in the palace and cut off his head. Septimius Severus entered Rome without a fight and established a new dynasty, one founded explicitly on military power. His famous deathbed advice to his sons was simple and chilling: enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else. This was the new reality. The emperor was no longer the first citizen or a god-king. He was the commander-in-chief of the most powerful army, and his rule lasted only as long as he kept the legions happy. Severus's son Caligula took this advice to heart. A brutal, thuggish man, he began his reign by murdering his own brother Geta in their mother's arms. He then massacred thousands of Geta's supporters. His one significant act was the Antonine Constitution of 212, which granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. This was not an act of enlightened generosity. It was a fiscal measure designed to broaden the tax base so he could pay his soldiers more. He was eventually assassinated by one of his own men while urinating on the side of a road during a campaign in the east. After another brief, chaotic interlude, the throne fell to a figure so bizarre, so alien to Roman values, that he made Caligula and Nero look like models of convention. His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but he is known to history by the name of the god he worshipped, Elagabalus. He was a 14-year-old Syrian boy, the hereditary high priest of the sun god Elagabal from the city of Emesa. Pushed onto the throne by his politically savvy grandmother Julia Maesa, he arrived in Rome not as a Roman emperor, but as a walking cultural cataclysm. He brought his god with him, a conical black meteorite, which he installed in a lavish new temple on the Palatine Hill, and declared the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon, placing him above Jupiter himself. His reign was not about power in the traditional sense. It was a religious and sexual revolution that shocked the conservative Roman establishment to its core. Elagabalus's Rome was a fever dream of Eastern mysticism and sexual transgression. He would perform ecstatic dances before his stone god, dressed in silk robes, his face painted with makeup. He forced senators to participate in these bizarre rituals. He held a sacred marriage between his god Elagabal and the goddess Vesta, a symbolic act that horrified the populace by uniting a foreign deity with one of Rome's most sacred protectors. His personal life was a source of constant scandal. He married and divorced 5 women, including a Vestal Virgin, an act of supreme sacrilege that was punishable by being buried alive. But his real passions were for men, he appointed his lovers to the highest offices of state. His chariot driver, a blonde slave named Hierocles, was his husband, and Elagabalus reportedly delighted in being beaten by him. He was said to have roamed the palace at night dressed as a woman, offering himself to guards, and even sought out physicians who could perform a sex change operation, offering them vast rewards. This was not just personal perversion, it was a systematic inversion of Roman identity. The emperor, the paterfamilias of the state, was actively trying to become a woman. He appointed a hairdresser to head the grain supply and a dancer to command the city watch. A senate of women was established under his mother's direction to rule on matters of fashion and etiquette. For the hardened soldiers of the legions and the traditionalist senators, this was more than madness. It was an abomination. The empire that had conquered the world was being ruled by a cross-dressing priest-king who worshipped a rock and was married to his charioteer. His own grandmother, Julia Maesa, who had engineered his rise to power, realized he had gone too far. He was destroying the Severan dynasty and risking a massive rebellion. She began to promote her other grandson, the more conventional and dignified Severus Alexander, as a potential replacement. Elagabalus, sensing the shift in loyalty, tried to have his cousin killed. It was the final straw. In the year 222, the Praetorian Guard, instigated by Maesa, mutinied. They stormed the palace and cornered the 17-year-old emperor, who was reportedly hiding in a latrine with his mother. They dragged them out and murdered them both. Their bodies were decapitated, stripped naked, and dragged through the streets of Rome. The soldiers tried to stuff the emperor's bloated corpse into a sewer, but it wouldn't fit. So they threw it, along with his mother's, into the Tiber from the same bridge as so many other imperial failures. The Black Stone was shipped back to Syria. Rome had violently purged the foreign contamination. The reign of Elagabalus was the lurid, orgiastic climax of imperial insanity, a brief but unforgettable spectacle of what happens when the cultural foundations of an empire are shattered by the whims of its ruler. It was a sign that the very definition of what it meant to be Roman was up for debate. This cultural chaos was a prelude to a political chaos that would dwarf even the year of the 4 emperors. The empire was about to enter a half-century of near-total collapse, an age where emperors were little more than disposable warlords, rising and falling with the bloody tide of military anarchy. This was the crisis of the 3rd century. The murder of the last Severan emperor in 235 plunged the Roman Empire into 50 years of unrelenting nightmare. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, an era of such endemic violence and instability that it threatened to extinguish Roman civilization entirely. It was a period where the madness was no longer confined to the man on the throne. The entire system had become insane. The empire was a wounded beast, thrashing in its death throes, savaged from without by barbarian invasions and from within by its own armies. Emperors came and went like fleeting shadows, their reigns often measured in months, not years. Power was no longer a lifetime appointment, it was a death sentence. To be proclaimed emperor by your troops was not a triumph, but the beginning of a frantic race against your own assassination. The first of these barracks emperors was Maximinus Thrax, a Thracian peasant of immense physical size who had risen through the military ranks. He was the ultimate soldier's soldier, but he despised the Senate and the aristocracy. He never even set foot in Rome during his 3-year reign, ruling instead from his military camps on the frontier. His rule was a brutal military dictatorship, financed by confiscating the wealth of the rich. He was eventually murdered by his own troops, who were tired of his endless campaigns and cruelty. What followed was a dizzying, bloody carousel of usurpers and pretenders. In the year 238 alone, 6 different men were recognized as emperor. The Senate tried to reassert its authority by appointing 2 of their own, Pupienus and Balbinus, but they were quickly dragged from the palace and slaughtered by the Praetorian Guard, who then installed the 13-year-old Gordian III. He, in turn, was likely murdered by his Praetorian prefect, who became Philip the Arab. Philip celebrated Rome's 1000th anniversary with lavish games, but was soon killed in battle by his successor, Decius. Decius initiated the first empire-wide systematic persecution of Christians, believing their impiety was angering the gods and causing the empire's misfortunes. Decius himself was then killed in battle against the Goths, the first Roman emperor to die fighting a foreign enemy. The list goes on, a grim litany of violent death. Gallus, Aemilianus, Valerian, who was captured by the Persians and, according to legend, used as a human footstool by their king before being flayed alive. In this era of chaos, the empire itself began to splinter. The Gallic Empire broke away in the west, and the Palmyrene Empire rose in the east under the warrior queen Zenobia. Rome was on the brink of total disintegration. The life of an emperor was now one of constant, grinding warfare. There was no time for the theatrical madness of a Caligula or the artistic pretensions of a Nero. This was the madness of pure survival. The emperor was a warlord, perpetually on campaign, sleeping in a military tent, his hand never far from his sword. His enemies were everywhere, the Goths across the Danube, the Sassanids in Persia, and, most dangerous of all, the soldiers in his own tent. A single military defeat, a delay in pay, or simply the ambition of a subordinate commander could mean a swift and bloody end. The average reign of an emperor during this period was less than 2 years. They were trapped in a vicious cycle. To survive, they needed the loyalty of the army. To ensure that loyalty, they needed to win victories and provide plunder and high pay. This required constant warfare and heavy taxes, which impoverished the populace and bred resentment, which in turn led to more revolts and usurpations. The empire was eating itself alive. What would you choose if you were a Roman general in the 3rd century? The near-certain death that came with the imperial purple, or the relative safety of an anonymous life on the frontier? Share your survival strategy in the comments. This half-century of anarchy was finally brought to a halt by a series of tough, pragmatic soldier emperors from the province of Illyria. Men like Claudius Gothicus and, most importantly, Aurelian, who in a whirlwind 5-year reign defeated multiple barbarian invasions, reconquered both the Gallic and Palmyrene breakaway empires, and reunified the Roman world. He was hailed as Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. But even he could not escape the curse. He was assassinated by his own officers, the victims of a forged document that suggested he was about to execute them. The disease was in the very bones of the system. The empire needed more than a strong general. It needed to be completely reforged. The man who would undertake that task was not a traditional Roman aristocrat, but another Illyrian soldier, a man born as a freed slave's son, who rose through the ranks to become the absolute master of the Roman world. His name was Diocles. We know him as Diocletian, and his solution to the crisis was a new kind of madness, the madness of absolute order. Diocletian understood that the old system was broken beyond repair. The Principate, the idea of the emperor as the first citizen, was a fiction that had died long ago. He replaced it with the Dominate, casting the emperor not as the first among equals, but as an untouchable, godlike monarch in the style of an Eastern potentate. He demanded prostration, wore a jeweled diadem, and was surrounded by a rigid court ceremonial designed to elevate him far above mere mortals. His goal was to restore stability, and he believed the only way to do it was through total control. To solve the problem of succession and rebellion, he instituted a radical new system, the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. He divided the empire into an eastern and western half, each ruled by a senior emperor, an Augustus, who was assisted by a junior emperor, a Caesar. The Caesars would eventually succeed the Augusti, ensuring a smooth transition of power. It was a brilliant logical solution on paper. In practice, it was an admission that the empire had become too vast and unwell to be ruled by one man. Diocletian's pursuit of order extended to every facet of life. To combat hyperinflation, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301, a decree that set fixed prices for thousands of goods and services as well as wages for all professions. The penalty for violating the edict was death. The result was an economic catastrophe. Goods vanished from the market, trade ground to a halt, and a massive black market emerged. The law was ultimately unenforceable and had to be abandoned. It was a tyrant's attempt to command economic reality, and it failed spectacularly. His passion for control also led him to launch the most severe and widespread persecution of Christians in the empire's history. Known as the Great Persecution, it was a systematic effort to wipe out the faith, which he saw as a subversive organization that threatened the traditional Roman order and the unity of the state. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, and clergy were arrested. Christians were forced to sacrifice to the Roman gods on pain of torture and execution. It was a brutal, state-sponsored campaign of terror, a cold, calculated cruelty enacted in the name of imperial unity. Diocletian was not mad in the way Caligula or Elagabalus were mad. He was not driven by personal vice or bizarre whims. His was a chillingly rational madness, the madness of a social engineer willing to sacrifice all freedom for the sake of stability. He was the tyrant as a reformer, the architect of a totalitarian state designed to save civilization from itself. He built a cage for the empire to stop it from tearing itself apart. And then, in the year 305, he did something unprecedented, something no Roman emperor before him had ever done. He voluntarily abdicated his power. Along with his co-Augustus Maximian, he retired from public life. He withdrew to a massive fortified palace he had built on the Dalmatian coast in modern-day Split, Croatia. He spent his final years growing vegetables. When his former colleague Maximian tried to entice him back into power to resolve the conflicts that had immediately broken out among their successors, Diocletian famously replied that if he could show him the cabbages he had planted with his own hands, he would never suggest he replace the peace and quiet of his garden with the storms of the greedy world. The man who had remade the empire had found peace not on the throne, but in a cabbage patch. Yet the system he created, the tetrarchy, collapsed into civil war almost as soon as he left the stage. His carefully constructed machine of 4 rulers was destroyed by the one thing he could not regulate: human ambition. The Caesars and the sons of the Augusti immediately began to fight for supreme power. The cage had been broken, and the wolves were at each other's throats once again. Diocletian had saved the empire from the chaos of the 3rd century, but at a terrible cost. He had created a rigid, bureaucratic and oppressive state that would form the template for the later Byzantine Empire. He had demonstrated that the only alternative to anarchy was despotism. The legacy of his brutal, orderly madness would be inherited by the man who would emerge victorious from the wars of the Tetrarchy, a man who would change the world forever. This man would take Diocletian's model of autocratic rule and fuse it with the very religion Diocletian had tried to destroy. His name was Constantine. The collapse of the Tetrarchy unleashed a new round of civil wars, a multi-sided struggle for ultimate power. Out of this crucible of violence emerged a figure of world historical importance: Constantine the Great. He was the son of one of Diocletian's original Caesars, a brilliant general and a ruthless politician. His rise to power was a masterclass in strategic violence and political opportunism. The most decisive moment came in the year 312 at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome, where he faced his rival Maxentius. It is here that history and legend intertwine. According to the Christian historian Eusebius, on the eve of the battle, Constantine looked to the sun and saw a cross of light above it, and with it the Greek words en tuto nika. In this sign, conquer. That night he had a dream in which Christ appeared to him and told him to use the sign of the cross against his enemies. Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the Chiro, a Christian symbol, on their shields. They won a stunning victory. Maxentius was driven into the Tiber, where he drowned. Constantine entered Rome as the undisputed master of the West. Was this a genuine conversion experience or a stroke of political genius? Constantine had recognized the growing power of the Christian faith. After decades of persecution, it had not been broken. It had been tempered, its organization strengthened, its followers filled with the conviction of martyrs. By aligning himself with this dynamic and growing movement, he gained a powerful ideological tool and the fervent support of a significant portion of the population. He became the patron of a new god, a god of victory. The Edict of Milan, issued the following year, officially ended the persecution and granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. It was a revolutionary moment, but the embrace of Christianity did not mellow the brutal calculus of Roman power. Constantine was a Roman emperor first and a Christian second. His path to becoming the sole ruler of the empire was paved with the bodies of his rivals, including his co-emperor in the east, Licinius, whom he had defeated and executed despite promising to spare his life. The poison of absolute power, the paranoia that had afflicted so many of his predecessors, did not spare the first Christian emperor. The court of Constantine was as full of intrigue and bloodshed as any pagan court. In the year 326, a dark domestic tragedy unfolded. Constantine ordered the execution of his own eldest son, Crispus. Crispus was a popular and brilliant military commander who had won several key victories for his father. The reasons for his death are shrouded in mystery and court slander. The most common account from the pagan historian Zosimus is that Constantine's second wife, Fausta, accused Crispus of trying to seduce her. Shortly after Crispus was killed, Constantine discovered the accusation was false. In a rage, he had Fausta executed by locking her in an overheated bath. A saint of the new religion had murdered his son and boiled his wife. The methods of the old tyrants had found a comfortable home in the new Christian empire. Power had not been sanctified, it had simply put on a new robe. Constantine's greatest legacy was the founding of a new capital. He chose the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, strategically located on the strait between Europe and Asia, and rebuilt it on a magnificent scale. It was to be the new Rome, and he named it after himself, Constantinople. This act shifted the center of gravity of the empire eastward and laid the foundations for what would become the Byzantine Empire, a Roman state that would endure for another 1,000 years after the western half collapsed. He filled his new city with churches, but also with pagan statues plundered from across the empire. It was a city that looked forward to a Christian future, but was built with the stones of a pagan past. Constantine had baptized the empire, but its soul remained deeply, tragically, Roman. The traditions of palace coups, assassinations, and merciless struggles for the throne would continue with unabated fury in the gilded halls of Constantinople. The new faith did not eradicate the old sins, it simply provided a new vocabulary to justify them. So was Constantine a saint or a sinner, a visionary who steered humanity toward a new spiritual age, or a cold-blooded opportunist who used a cross as a stepping stone to a throne? The answer is that he was both. He was a transitional figure, a man with one foot in the brutal pagan world of Diocletian and the other in the Christian Middle Ages. He was a sincere believer who also understood that faith could be the ultimate instrument of statecraft. His reign demonstrates the most unsettling truth about the marriage of power and piety, that the claim of divine sanction can be used to justify the most profane of acts. He did not end the story of Roman madness, he simply gave it a new and more complex chapter. The emperors who followed him would no longer claim to be gods themselves, but they would claim to be God's chosen representatives on earth, a justification for absolute power that would echo through the corridors of history for centuries to come. The dark genius of Constantine was to understand that the most potent form of control is not over the body, but over the soul. Why do they haunt us still? 2 millennia after their deaths, why do the names Caligula, Nero, and Elagabalus still possess the power to shock and fascinate? We tell their stories not as cautionary tales, for history shows that humanity rarely learns from its mistakes, but as primal myths. They are the boogeymen of our collective political imagination, the ultimate examples of what happens when the fragile restraints of human decency are removed. They are not merely historical figures, they are archetypes, living symbols of the darkness that lurks beneath the thin veneer of civilization. Their reigns are a funhouse mirror, grotesquely distorting the human face, yet showing us something undeniably true about ourselves. Our secret fascination with absolute freedom, the terrifying allure of a world with no consequences. In an age of spreadsheets and committee meetings, their flamboyant homicidal whimsy has a strange, almost theatrical appeal. They are the ultimate anti-heroes in the long, bloody drama of power. The madness of the Roman emperors was not a random anomaly. It was a systemic disease, a virus incubated in the very structure of their power. The Roman system, born from a republic that fiercely rejected the idea of kings, ironically ended up creating a position of such omnipotence that it was almost guaranteed to destroy the man who held it. When you are told you are a living God, when every whim is law, when you hold the power of life and death over millions, what happens to the human psyche? It inflates, it warps, and then it shatters. The emperors were not necessarily born monsters, they were men who were placed in a monstrous position. Their story is the ultimate proof that no single human being is equipped to wield the power of a god. The curse of absolute power is that it grants you everything except the one thing you need most, a reason to say no to yourself. Their perversions, their cruelty, their megalomania, these were not just the acts of broken individuals. They were a reflection of the society that allowed them to happen. For every mad emperor, there was a sycophantic senate willing to applaud his horse. For every paranoid tyrant, there were informers eager to profit from his fear. For every debauched ruler, there was a populace distracted by bread and circuses. The monsters on the throne were merely the symptom. The disease was a culture that had traded its freedom for stability, its dignity for spectacle. They showed the Roman world and us a terrifying truth, that at the heart of the most sophisticated civilization can lie a profound moral emptiness, a void that can only be filled with ever more extreme sensations. The Romans built aqueducts and wrote epic poetry, but they also built the Colosseum, a place where the suffering of others became the ultimate form of public entertainment. The madness of the emperors was simply the privatization of that public bloodlust. The echoes of their reigns reverberate through history. Every tyrant who builds a cult of personality, every dictator who slaughters his own people, every leader who blurs the line between the state and his own ego is walking in the footsteps of the mad Caesars. They are the ghosts in the machine of modern politics, a constant reminder of the destructive potential of unchecked authority. Their stories are not ancient history, they are a perpetual warning. They force us to ask unsettling questions about our own time. Where is the line between a strong leader and a tyrant? How much power is too much? And what dark appetites do we, the audience, feed with our own fascination for the spectacle of power? The faces change, the titles evolve, but the throne remains, an object of supreme temptation. The story of Rome is the story of what that temptation does to a human soul. It shows us that the greatest empire in the world can be brought to its knees not by barbarian hordes, but by the moral rot that begins in a single, all-powerful heart. Look around you. Who holds power today, and at what cost? Tell us in the comments, has anything truly changed, or are we all just living in the long shadow of Rome?